what philosophy is in the Christian context, namely the handmaid to theology, an entirely independent standing discipline, but one which, in a Christian context, is ordered to the same thing that theology is, namely to bring us into greater knowledge of God through knowing the world that He has created. And so philosophy, like theology, orders us to God and helps us to attain happiness.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's my first time in California, and I'm enjoying it very much so far. And please excuse me for just reading my paper. Usually I don't like just to read papers when I give a presentation, but in that case, since English is not my mother tongue, I just have to read down what I have written and then I hope translate it in a way that it is understandable. I'm not so sure about that, but well, let's see. So I'm talking this morning on the question of personhood and recognition. That means the talk is mainly going to be talk about ethics or the role of personhood in ethics. So there will not be much theology in it, but I think there are at least some points where one could also link it to theological debates, and I think Father Schenk will do that later on. So, well, I said personhood and recognition, a Fichtean approach. Here you see Fichte it's a cartoon made by Johann Gottfried Schadow, the architect of the Brandenburg Gate. It's not very favorable, it's just the typical confused philosopher thinking about whatever. So, in my presentation I will just present you the quotes and not much more. And of course, I can just show you what I'm going to talk about. First, I will try to explore the ethical dimension of personhood. Then I will talk about recognition theoretical approaches in general a little bit. And then I will really get into Fichte, talking about the circle of self-consciousness, as Dieter Henrich has called it. And then I will deal with some objections to an intersubjectivist theory of subjectivity. And the last chapter of my talk will be about recognition and nature, and that's the bioethical chapter of the presentation. So, I come to the introduction, the ethical dimension of personhood. It is characteristic for the concept of a person that it's not only an ontological or descriptive concept, that is a concept that describes a certain mode of being, but at the same time a normative concept. If a living being is experienced or identified as a person, this experience carries with itself a normative claim. The claim to recognize it as a subject of rights, or at least as a being with regard to which we have strong duties. And this is even true if we do not yet know what exactly these rights or duties are, or how our ethical theory is further specified. That means that the concept of a person is not just some concept of practical philosophy, but its very core concept. Every ethical theory, be it utilitarian, virtue ethics, deontological, contractarian, or whatever, must make two presuppositions which refer to the concept of a person. First, the anti-solipsistic assumption that there are other subjects at all. Second, the assumption that these others, that their lives, their interests, their needs, their rights, their freedom, do somehow matter in a normative sense. Now, many ethical theories just presuppose these two assumptions without further justifying or addressing them. Notable exceptions are, of course, Kant and Fichte, about whom I will speak today. This means that many, if not most, ethical theories have a blind spot which can be articulated by asking, what obliges me to respect the lives, the interests, the needs, or whatever of other people? The concept person tries to give an answer to this question. It is the fact that they are persons that obliges me to this kind of respect. Hence, person is one of those fundamental concepts in practical philosophy that are meant to bridge the gap between is and ought, between normativity and descriptivity. Notwithstanding the notorious charge of an is-ought fallacy, this is not something particular to a certain ethical theory, but something necessary to any ethical theory. Any ethical theory needs a systematic place for such a bridging concept. For example, in preference utilitarianism, it is the concept of interest. In Kantianism, it's dignity and autonomy. In virtue ethics, it's eudaimonia, etc., etc. However, this observation does not answer the question how the claim that personhood is the foundation of duties and rights can be explained without falling into some philosophical obscurantism or just giving dry assertion, as probably Hegel would have said. This is even more so because the concept of a person has a certain paradoxical structure that Robert Spähmann has pointed out. On the one hand, the experience of someone as a person is the foundation of duties and obligations towards him. But at the same time, there is also already some kind of fundamental duty to recognize another human being or another subject as a person. Spähmann writes, and this is my first quote, it's, by the way, I found it in an English translation which was not made by Father Ramelow, so we cannot ask him what it means if you... So, okay, the quote by Spähmann. Duties of one to another are generated by the moment of recognition in which one person notices another. Prior to this moment, there is no obligation. On the contrary, obligation follows from noticing the person, which is one and the same as recognizing another as like myself. Yet, to recognize a person is not to posit one as if we owed our personal existence to someone else's recognition. I recognize because recognition is due, yet I do not first know that it is due, then recognize. To know that it is due is no more and no less than to recognize. Now, if this is true, and I marked the relevant parts here in red, there is a problem. The problem is, how is it supposed to be possible that something is the very foundation of moral obligations? Prior to this moment, there is no obligation. And that at the same time, recognition is a moral obligation in itself. Recognition is due. Now, especially since Fichte's foundation of natural right, a specific type of theories, usually called theories of recognition, with the term Spähmann himself uses here, try to answer this question. This type of theories has become quite influential, especially with Hegel's famous master-slave chapter in the phenomenology of spirit, and it has inspired a lot of contemporary thinkers as different as Jürgen Habermas, Axel Honneth, Charles Taylor, Jean Piaget, Paul Ricoeur, Stephen Darwall, and Robert Spähmann. Just recently, psychologist Wolfgang Prinz has revisited and extended this approach from the perspective of his discipline in the book, Open Minds, The Social Making of Agency and Intentionality. I think it appeared in 2012. So, what does that mean? What do we mean by recognition theories right now? This is the second chapter of my presentation. I think that the quintessential recognition theoretical approach can be characterized by 5 basic features. This does not mean that the works of all the above-mentioned authors contain all these features. Some authors just have 1 or 2 of the features, but other authors, like, for example, Fichte, deal with all these features. The starting point, and that's the first feature, is the assumption that intersubjectivity is the condition of possibility of individual finite subjectivity. That means that intersubjectivity is prior and constitutive for individual finite subjectivity, or as Habermas sums it up, rather self-consciousness forms itself from outside to inside through a symbolically mediated relation with an interactor. In this sense, it has an intersubjective core. The second basic feature of recognition theories, I just sum it up a little bit here. The second feature is that the intersubjective process constitutive for individual subjectivity has the character of a reciprocal recognition of finite subjects as subjects. According to this, the very existence of finite individual subjects can only be explained as the result of an act of recognition by another or by many other subjects. Therefore, every subject can only understand herself as a subject if she understands herself as a part of a broader intersubjective process of mutual recognition, which is prior to herself as a subject. Third point, acts of recognition can only be performed in freedom by other subjects. In order to conceive of herself as free, a subject therefore must admit that there are other free subjects. Furthermore, she has to grant them the freedom that is necessary to perform an act of recognition at all. Hence, the freedom and subjectivity of others turns out to be the condition of my own freedom and subjectivity, and vice versa. My own freedom and subjectivity turns out to be the condition of other subjects' freedom and subjectivity. That was my third point. Fourth point, if we take 2 and 3 together, this leads to a more specified act of recognition, the recognition of other subjects as beings characterized by freedom. Therefore, the recognition of other subjects as subjects implies their recognition as free beings. And there we come to the fifth and eventually the fifth point and the conclusion. Fifth point, the recognition of other subjects as free beings combined with the insight that my own free subjectivity has the freedom of other subjects as its condition leads to a second specification of the act of recognition. If there is a plurality of interconnected free subjects, every single subject can only be free in a practical sense if every subject limits its own sphere of freedom in a way that admits every other subject an indisposable yet limited sphere of freedom of its own. This means, and that's my conclusion, that recognition must be thought as the recognition of all other subjects as bearers of fundamental rights, or at least as beings towards whom every other person has strong ethical duties. And you will probably recognize here, the pun is not intended, I just don't have another word, you probably will recognize the Kant's principle of right, or Rawls' first principle of justice in what I have said here. So every subject must limit its own sphere of subject so that every subject can be free in an equal way. Before I now explain these 5 features in a more detailed way, With regard to Fichte, let me please step back for a moment and take a brief look at the history and at the current use of the concept of recognition. What I have described so far leads first of all to a philosophical foundation of law, or rather, as Fichte himself said, of natural right. During the last 200 years, however, the concept has made its career rather in social philosophy than in the philosophy of law. Today, we mostly find it in authors like Axel Honneth, who turns it into an empirical concept derived from development psychology and social psychology. Or we find it in authors advocating a so-called politics of recognition, that is the claim that the identities of minority groups should be appreciated and honored in public and by the public, which usually goes hand in hand with the strive to deconstruct the majority identity. Well, you know about that here in Berkeley. I don't have to explain that any further, I guess. So, both approaches, however, do not deal with what Fichte and Hegel meant by recognition. In Hegel and Fichte, recognition is a transcendental concept by which they try to reveal intersubjectivity as the condition of possibility of finite individual subjectivity. And this then lays the ground of law and ethics as such. Contrary to that, recognition in the sense of Honneth, Young, Butler, etc., is a politico-psychological concept which is about the affirmation of self-esteem and group identities. Especially in the work of Honneth, the crucial difference between the two meanings of recognition is almost systematically blurred. It does therefore not astonish that most of Honneth's contribution to that's the subtitle of his book, Structure of Social Recognition Relations, amount to a discussion of the findings of empirical psychology on the formation of self-esteem and self-respect. Over this, he completely loses sight of the relevant normative question, that is the question what obliges us to respect others as subjects of fundamental rights. Instead, he proposes a philosophical version of descriptive social psychology which is underpinned by some more or less explicit normative premises. These premises, however, are never justified within the theory itself, and this is probably the case because they cannot be justified within such a theoretical framework. The reason for these confusions is obviously an ambiguity in the expression recognition. On the one hand, at least in German, recognition can mean an act of affirmation of the psychological self-esteem of a person by another person. For example, if we say about an athlete, this jump was an achievement that should be acknowledged. In German here we would use anerkennen for acknowledge, and I think you could also form a similar phrase in English probably. On the other hand, we talk about recognition in the sense of recognizing something as having a certain legal or normative status, like for example, when we say that a new political entity has been recognized by the international community as a state. It is this latter sense of recognition that is prevalent in Fichte, in Hegel, Spemann, and even still in Habermas. Now, I first want to clarify the transcendental concept of recognition with reference to Fichte's initial proposal in the Foundations of Natural Right, which was, by the way, published 1 year before Kant's Doctrine of Right in 1796. Then I'm going to discuss some objections to the idea that intersubjectivity is prior to subjectivity. And against this background, I will try to propose a theory of recognition that can be defended, at least against the main objection. And finally, as I already said, I will outline some bioethical implications of my proposal. Part 3, the circle of self-consciousness. Fichte's starting point in the Foundation of Natural Right is a problem which Dieter Henrich has described in a famous paper from 1967 as Fichte's initial insight. According to this, any attempt to explain the existence of self-consciousness as an act of reflection by which an already existing mind somehow starts to observe itself, leads into a circle and therefore fails. In order to understand this, we first have to clarify what it means to exist as a self-conscious subject. Existing as a self in this sense means for P to exist as a conscious reference to herself. Of course, one might object that a person P is not only a self-referring subject, but also has, or rather is, a body and does exist as a corporeal being. But this objection would miss the point, since P would not be a subject if it were only a body. What makes P a self-conscious subject is her reference to herself. So for a subject, being is self-reference. Yet we have to be more precise. A kind of self-reference that in some way knows that it is self-reference. This point is important because there are many forms of unconscious self-reference. Many technical devices, Father Anselm already mentioned a thermostat or a more sophisticated temperature regulator, refer to themselves. Plants and animals refer to themselves, for example, when they incorporate nutrients. We describe living beings in general in terms of self-organization, self-maintenance, and so on and so on. These are all types of self-reference. And even humans sometimes refer to themselves unconsciously. For example, when a person reads a text about herself, but doesn't know that it is about herself. Then she refers to herself, but she doesn't know that she refers to herself. Therefore, self-reference is only self-consciousness if the self-reference is a special kind of self-reference that is aware of its being self-reference, or in other words, conscious self-reference. This whole structure, however, seems to make the existence of selves or subjects in this world mysterious, as Dieter Henrich and before him Hermann Schmitz have pointed out. It seems that any attempt to explain the coming into being of a self-conscious entity through an act of reflexive self-observation must presuppose that this entity already exists as a self-conscious entity, since otherwise the reference to herself would not be the reference of a self-conscious entity to a self-conscious entity and therefore not self-reference. Rather, it would be that of a self-conscious entity to a non-self-conscious entity, and this isn't self-reference, because consciousness and self-consciousness would be two distinct entities. Henrich describes this problem as follows. I tried to translate that, but I must admit that it was really difficult to translate it. I am supposed to be the one who refers to himself through an act of reflection. Therefore, he who starts the reflection must already be both at the same time, the one who knows and the one that is known. But then the subject of reflection already satisfies the whole equation I equals I beforehand. Yet, this equation is supposed to come into being only through the act of reflection. So, when it's written down, we don't have the problem to confuse I and I with Jesus losing his eyes or whatever. No. So, for this reason, already Fichte tried to determine the character of subjectivity as a kind of a permanent activity of self-positioning, in German Tathandlung, rather than a fact, in German Tatsache. Fichte says every reflection refers to something as its object be, but what kind of thing must the object of the reflection in question be? A rational being is supposed to posit herself, to have herself as her object. But her characteristic is the activity of referring to herself. The ultimate and highest substratum B of her reflection on herself must therefore be the activity of referring to herself. Now, this is rather a description of the problem than a solution. Specifically, in his Foundations of Natural Right, Fichte takes the problem a step further by introducing intersubjectivity into the picture. As already in the Wissenschaftslehre, he insists that the constitution of self-consciousness can only be explained via practical self-consciousness, because theoretical consciousness is in a certain way always consumed by the object it thinks. By setting, pursuing, and realizing aims and ends, however, the self is free from being determined by the object it thinks. In a theoretical perspective, knowing something can be turned into self-consciousness because I can always think of myself as the one who thinks that object. That's Kant's transcendental apperception. The practical perspective, to the contrary, must go along with self-consciousness, because I cannot think of an end that I have chosen and that I pursue without referring to myself. And that's why freedom is crucial for the constitution of subjectivity. There is no self-consciousness without the very basic experience of being able to determine some object freely instead of being determined by it. Yet, this kind of freedom seems to require that I am already conscious of myself, because otherwise there would be no self who could choose and pursue her ends. And at this point, the infamous circle of self-consciousness seems to return in a different yet equally destructive way. Self-consciousness requires the practical experience of oneself as free, but being free requires an already existing theoretical self-consciousness. Now, Fichte's answer to this problem is to think of the freedom of one being, say Smith, as something that is initially proposed to Smith by another free being, say Jones. It is Jones who thinks theoretically of Smith as a free being. For Jones, it is not circular to have Smith as an external object of his thoughts in a theoretical perspective. Professor van Frazen would probably speak about a thing in the world, and to think of her as a practically free and self-referring being. This would be impossible for Smith, because having herself theoretically as an external object of her thoughts, brought to mind through an act of reflection, negates precisely the freedom and self-reference we want to explain. Therefore, only Jones or any other subject can perform a speech act of inviting Smith to act freely upon some object. Fichte in German speaks of Aufforderung, auffordern, to invite. It's a bit stronger than inviting, actually. An example of this would be something like, you decide what we are going to do with that piece of wood, or even do something with that piece of wood or leave it. This invitation to freedom performed by Jones negates the initial passive relation of Smith towards the object, but on behalf of Smith. Smith must react to the invitation and does so by setting a goal of his own with regard to that object. By doing so, Smith experiences himself as a being that is able to freely decide what to do with some external object. It's important to keep in mind here that Jones' invitation to freedom addresses Smith not only as an entity that has goals and ends, but as someone who posits his goals freely. This is important because animals also have goals and pursue ends. They are, however, not able to decide about their ends or to posit them, as Fichte would say. So Jones addresses Smith as someone who could always do otherwise. On the side of Smith, being addressed as someone able to do otherwise brings about an explicit self-reference which Smith could not have brought about on his own. On these grounds, Fichte reaches the following conclusion, and I think that's a very interesting quote. The human being becomes a human being only among other human beings, and since the human being can be nothing other than a human being and would not exist at all if it were not this, it follows that if there are to be human beings at all, there must be more than one. Thus, the concept of a human being is not the concept of an individual, for an individual human being is unthinkable, but the concept of a species. In the foundation of natural right, Fichte then builds up on this theory in order to derive his concept of mutual recognition of persons as bearers of rights. This deduction goes more or less along the lines of thought which I have already pointed out in my discussion of the 5 basic features of recognition theories. If one subject would claim an unlimited sphere of freedom, that is, claim all freedom for her, she would negate the condition of possibility of her own existence as a free subject. Therefore, every single subject must limit her sphere of freedom with regard to the freedom of all other subjects, just as the other subjects must limit their spheres of freedom for the same reason. This leads to a system of mutually limited spheres of freedom in which every subject is endowed with her own legitimate and violable sphere of limited freedom. So everybody's sphere of freedom is limited, but unviolable, and it can only be unviolable because it's limited. The system of mutually limited freedom is called the law, and the normative claims implied in the idea of a known yet limited sphere of freedom are called rights. The right to life, to property, to free speech, freedom of religion, etc. Fichte himself has, by the way, a 2-level theory of rights. On the first level, there is an original right, Urrecht, which is the right to freedom, life, and bodily integrity. And from this original right, he then derives a lot of other fundamental human rights on a second level. So, this is basically the Fichtean approach I wanted to talk about, but now there are, of course, objections against such a theory. Even the brief sketch, even the brief sketch I have shown you raises some serious questions. The first objection mainly concerns Fichte, as, for example, Vittorio Hösli has suggested. Fichte's approach could lead into another infinite regress because there always has to be a subject or a person in order to awaken personhood in other beings with a disposition to subjectivity. So there must have been a first being who did not need an invitation to freedom in order to exist as a subject, and so this is maybe a link to theology. Of course, Fichte is aware of this problem and introduces God as his first unconditioned subject that does not need other subject to be what he is. However, this actually literally seems like a deus ex machina who is just introduced to save an otherwise problematic theory. There is, however, another and even maybe more fundamental objection, an objection to the very idea that intersubjectivity is prior to subjectivity. This objection was specifically put forward by Dieter Henrich and Manfred Frank against Habermas' version of the argument. It has, by the way, been persistently ignored by Habermas. The main point of the objection is that recognition theories, like the one of Habermas, propose that finite subjectivity is the result of an adoption of the perspective of an interactor. The interactor thinks of myself as a subject, and by adopting her perspective, I come to develop a self and think of myself as a subject. According to Henrich and Frank, however, such an adoption would not be possible if I were not already a self-conscious being, for I can only relate another person's perspective on myself to myself if I can already refer to myself at all. Henrich therefore writes, and I think he's simply right about that, if I had not already the possibility to relate to myself, I could by no means of studying self-relations in the world be prompted to draw the conclusion that I exist and that I am essentially in such a relation. And, well, Manfred Frank points out, Habermas gives a very instructive example of a circular explanation of self-consciousness when he writes that the self consists in a performative self-relation created by relating another one's perspective to oneself. I think a possible solution to this problem can be found in the recognition theories of Hegel and Spemann. Both authors seem to think that self-consciousness as such is not constituted via intersubjectivity. Nonetheless, they think that the realization and stabilization of self-consciousness can only take place within the framework of an intersubjective world. Hegel, for example, in the Master-Slave chapter makes a distinction between self-consciousness, which is possible without recognition, and the truth of self-consciousness, which is something like a realization of self-consciousness. A similar thought can be found in Spemann. It's a long quote: a solipsistic consciousness encompassing the whole terrain of reality in itself would not get so far as to understand itself as being. Its being, like everything else, would be no more than a thought. A solipsistic cogito would have to be expressed as I think, that I think, that I think, and so on. For Descartes, it takes the thought of another thinker, God or an evil demon, to bring this infinite series of reflections to an end. The other cannot mistake my thought for his own, for I am not merely his thought. So in relation to him, my thought acquires the dignity of being. Unfortunately, Spemann does not really explain this idea any further, but I think, as we have seen, the circle of self-consciousness is caused by the fact that self-consciousness cannot come into being by referring to something that is not already conscious self-reference, because then it would not be self-reference. Manfred Frank has tried to solve this problem by recurring to Sartre's idea of a pre-reflexive cogito. According to Frank, the problem only exists because we usually try to understand conscious self-reference as the result of a posterior act of reflection, by which a mind starts to observe his own thoughts and perception. The alternative to this approach is to think of self-consciousness as something that is already present in any act of conscious reference to an external object. Fichte called this coincidence of consciousness and self-consciousness the intellectual intuition, which is also a term borrowed from theology. What reflection then does is to make this implicit self-reference already given in any act of reference to an object explicit. I think that Schelling, Sartre, and Frank are simply right about this. The idea of a pre-reflexive self-awareness, no matter how to explain it further, seems to be the only viable solution to the problem of self-consciousness. On the other hand, I think that Frank, Schelling, and Sartre miss one extremely important point. If their description is right, this pre-reflexive self-awareness is purely instantaneous and presentist. It's nothing but the empty and formal implicit self-relation of the subject referring to an object. Thus, it cannot provide a personal identity over time. For personal identity over time, it is necessary to really make the implicit self-relation of the pre-reflexive self-awareness thematic or explicit through an act of posterior reflection. Only then self-consciousness can be the basis of personal identity over time, and only then we leave the grounds of pure presentism. Without an intersubjective framework, however, this act of reflection would only produce the I think that I think that I think that I think described in Spemann's critique of Descartes. Hence it would fall victim to an infinite regress like the one described in the circle of self-consciousness. This, however, is not true from the perspective of another person. In her perspective, I am not something that escapes into an infinite regress. For her, I can exist as a reflexive self-reference without falling victim to any circle, and this is important, at the same time I can relate her perspective to myself because I am already a pre-reflexive self-awareness. So adopting another one's perspective leads me, and this is the only possibility, leads me to think of myself as a corporeal being in the dimensions of past, present, and future. That is, only through this perspective I can be and think of myself as a person with a certain personal identity over time. And I think if we understand the relationship between subjectivity and intersubjectivity in this way, it is quite possible to save the essential insights of Fichte's, Hegel's, and Habermas' recognition theories, as well as the foundation of fundamental rights following from it. I can only be a person and understand myself as a person if there are other persons who at the same time can only be persons and understand themselves as person if they understand me as a person. Understanding myself as a person with rights and duties therefore implies to recognize other persons as subjects of rights and duties, or to be more precise, to already have them recognized. Now, just give me 5 more minutes for my very last point, if this is correct, I think it's evident that the process of recognition is not something that can rely on properties, characteristics, or traits that might be empirically observed or perceived. Real processes of recognition, especially the recognition of a being as a person, and hence endowed with fundamental rights, do not work through a conclusion from properties or characteristics to a moral status. If that would be true, the process of recognition would have the form of a syllogism of the following kind: an entity with property X has a normative claim to be recognized as a subject of rights, entity P has property X, therefore entity P has a claim to be recognized as a subject of rights. Most so-called liberal approaches in bioethics rely on such a syllogism, making the act of recognition dependent upon the existence of some externally observable properties. Real processes of recognition, however, do not ask for observable properties or characteristics of an entity, concluding from their existence or non-existence to a moral status of that entity. Now I wanted to speak a little bit about Kant, but I'll leave that out, because we already find such an idea in Kant. I'll just skip it and jump to Spemann. This is basically an argument that Spemann has put forward in the debates about embryonic stem cell research and abortion in Germany. Spemann insists that the idea of human dignity and human rights entail a kind of unconditionality which makes it impossible to make them dependent on objective properties, traits, or characteristics. Any kind of conditional recognition would miss the very essence of recognition, because recognition in itself comes with a normative claim to be unconditional. Spemann has expressed this thought as follows: if there is to be anything like human rights, then they are only possible given the presupposition that no one is entitled to render judgment whether someone is subject of such rights. For the logic of human rights entails that the human is not a member of the human society who is co-opted on the basis of certain properties, but that everyone enters it by virtue of his own rights. By virtue of his own right, however, can only mean by virtue of being a member of the biological species of Homo sapiens. This argument has been extremely influential in German debates, and I think, usually it has been understood as an elaborate version of Tucherism, that is, as a plea to rely on the most general and most non-arbitrary criterion possible when it comes to determine the scope of human rights, that is, the criterion of species membership. But I think that Spemann's argument must be understood in another way. The crucial point of his argument is the reference to nature, that is, the suggestion that everyone must enter the community of rights by virtue of his own right and therefore by virtue of his nature, because otherwise the act of recognition would not be an act of unconditional recognition. So Spemann introduces species membership to operationalize an essential aspect of recognition that I have already hinted at. Because recognition is an intersubjective process, it transcends our finite individual subjectivity. Therefore, the act of recognition is only an act of recognition if it is not the result of particularistic, subjectivist, and arbitrary decisions of finite subjects. Now, what is not made by us, but what forms itself and grows out of itself, is usually called nature or life, or to use a more technical term, entelechy. Thus, the reference to nature results from the insight that the intersubjective character of recognition urges us to think of it as something independent from our subjective arbitrary makings and suppositions. Only nature, and more specifically life and entelechy, fulfill this requirement because they are essentially what is independent from our finite subjectivity. Unborn human beings or humans in a persistent vegetative state therefore must be recognized as persons and as subjects of human dignity and human rights exactly because of this. If we would not recognize humans as persons by virtue of what they are by nature, we would not recognize them at all, because then our recognition would be conditioned by our finite subjectivity, and as we just have seen, conditioned recognition is not recognition. So, with this argument, I think we demonstrate that denying them recognition would rely on a misguided understanding of our own life form, a life form which cannot be the one of an isolated individual being, but only that of a species, as Fichte said, or a community of beings. Understood properly, we are bodily, social, and at the same time rational and free beings into whose life form recognition is already inscribed and takes place in every moment of our daily life. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just close it. Yeah. Oh, it's not away, but well, so just take it off. Here we are.
Thank you, Dr. Rothhaar. Our respondent this morning hails from the great city of Burbank in Southern California. He joined the Western Dominican Province, USA in 1971, receiving his initial philosophical and theological formation at the Dominican School and Graduate Theological Union. He received his PhD in dogmatic theology from the University of Munich and then did postdoctoral work at the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, focusing on the editing of medieval texts. Richard Schenk's teaching career began in 1990 at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, where he taught for over 20 years, within that time also serving as director for two research centers, the Institute for Philosophical Research in Hanover and the Intercultural Center for Faith and Culture at the John Paul II, the Second Cultural Center in Washington, D.C. More recently, he served from 2011 to 2014 as president of the Catholic University of Eichstätt-Ingolstadt. He also has taught at the University of Freiburg and Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Professor Schenk's interests and publications cover a range of topics from the theology of Karl Rahner to the reception and interpretation of the Second Vatican Council to a variety of philosophical, theological, and dogmatic theological themes. Recently, he has edited a volume with Wolfgang Pallaver, Mimetic Theory and World Religions, Studies in Violence, Mimesis, and Culture, a collection of essays by representatives of world religions engaging the theories of the late René Girard in application to contemporary religious problems. And just last year, he published Soundings in the History of Hope, New Studies in Thomas Aquinas, an effort at retrieving some seminal ideas from the angelic doctor and engaging them with the joys and hopes and griefs and sorrows of our time. Finally, within the Dominican Order, Professor Schenk has served as Regent of Studies and Vice Chancellor of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, as well as receiving the highest academic honor of the Order of Preachers in 2004, the title of Master of Sacred Theology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Father Richard Schenk.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers of this symposium. The German Constitution begins with a marvelous thought and a sentence that the dignity of the human being is inviolable, and that the goal and purpose of statehood is simply to protect this dignity. The need to protect this dignity tells us that the dignity is itself violated, although inviolable, and that the normative inviolability is not always respected in fact. And so we're grateful to philosophers like Dr. Rothhaar and Robert Spemann, who has been mentioned many times, who have brought the voice of philosophy to statecraft in order to encourage that the facts not wander off too far from the norms. I'd also like to thank Dr. Rothhaar now for his well-thought-through reflections today on what is obviously one of the central themes of his own philosophical calling. As he noted at the start, the path of reflected recognition is not the sole via inventionis of personhood, but it is in its implicit forms universal, and in its explicit forms a well-charted and accessible path, arguably the via manifesterior towards personal identity. I will begin my response by recalling two recent figures familiar with the topography of recognition approach to affirming human dignity as the basis for just laws, Robert Spemann, and whom Dr. Rothhaar has referred to many times now, and Paul Ricoeur, who has not yet been heard from. Let me begin with the second figure. After recalling thoughts from these two thinkers, I want to invite Thomas Aquinas increasingly into the discussion, not perhaps a huge surprise to you. In his own final work, The Course of Recognition from 2004, Paul Ricoeur, for all his studious avoidance of the concept and problematic of person, addressed many of the same issues with many of the same argumentative goals as those thematized by Markus Rothhaar in his talk today, regarding what several interconnected forms of recognition could tell us about subjectivity and intersubjectivity. Once these parallels are seen, one might ask if still other dimensions of recognition thematized by Ricoeur might augment Rothhaar's more explicit reflections on personhood. Recognition, Anerkennung in German, and Ricoeur's French text is kind enough to sometimes cite that as a memory of the thinkers who helped develop this idea. Recognition is meant by all these roughly contemporary thinkers as something more than, say, the acknowledgement and recognition of a sovereign nation by other sovereign nations, more than the acknowledgement of being recognized by the chair at a conference as a speaker being given the floor for a time, or again, as Rothhaar also shows in what he argues, will be in agreement with Spemann, more to than simply the acknowledgement or recognition of a juridically protected status as the claimant of rights. And yet there is another side, not just for Ricoeur, who is always keen on showing also the doubts about any theory and yet arguing for them, but because at the same time recognition is also meant to remind us that the recognition of personhood is also something less than direct, certain, and indisputable knowledge of an evidentiary kind. Markus Rothhaar referred to this lack of that kind of evidence in his talk. For this reason, Spemann can say, the recognition of being a self is always an act of freedom. Ricoeur returns in his cited work on the course of recognition to the idea of attestation, which is, in his mind, always a scattered or broken up attestation that he had already described as the watchword of his work, oneself as another. And there he had explored a kind of witness to selfhood, or witnesses to selfhood, that are found scattered or broken up, if you like, in the other instances than subjectivity, which, however, could be ignored or rejected only at the price of losing oneself. The three exemplary witnesses mentioned in that work, not meant as an exclusive list, of course, were 1, my body, as not always in life and certainly not in death, compliant to the wishes of myself, my subjectivity. Secondly, other persons who, as Levinas had reminded us, have bound us by obligations even before we ask them to do so. And 3, the conscience, insofar as it can differ even from good intentions of the moment. The reader might be reminded here of what Thomas Aquinas includes among the many voices of the conscience as obligation, legare, instigation, instigare, accusation and self-accusation, accusare, remorse, remordere, and even excusing, excusare, all calls of the conscience to be other than we already are. The list of testimony was not meant to be exhaustive and might be easily expanded to include further witnesses such as non-revisionist history, which was in fact a key topic of Ricoeur's memory, history, and forgetting, tedious work, labor improbus, and in certain contexts, the body of the other, as we heard in this Congress on Thursday evening. Common to all these witnesses is that they are given a hearing because a full sense of personhood is not self-evident. Anticipating all but the earliest segment in the course of recognition, robustness of the self is needed for the robust relationship to the other, without which it would atrophy as a self. Even at a consortium like ours here at GTU, relational ecumenism can thrive only as long as there is robust confessional identity for which each relationality is necessary. Ricoeur traced his sense of witness back through Levinas to Heidegger's Bezeugung, or testimony in being and time, but we might suspect here, as elsewhere, that Ricoeur had also profited philosophically from the best heritage of his Calvinist tradition. In attestation, synonymous with recognition, Ricoeur can include that affirmation of human capacities that never forgets the many reasons to doubt them, nor the cost of mistrusting them excessively. In the final passage of his final work, Ricoeur warns against the construction of a rivalrous opposition between readings of two of his principal sources of this kind of recognition of dignity of the self. Quote, that of Husserl, which takes the ego as its pole of reference, and that of Levinas, which proceeds from the other person to the ego. There's a very similar quote in Spemann's Person book in the chapter on recognition, page 169, but I won't read it here. Arguably proceeding somewhat more resolutely than Ricoeur or Spemann from the intersubjective sources of subjectivity, with reference not to Levinas but to Fichte, Markus Rothhaar has nonetheless avoided for his part this kind of feudal rivalry by making his own several of the emendations to Fichte's thought on the connection of subjectivity and intersubjectivity offered by Dieter Henrich, by Vittorio Hörsli, by Robert Spemann, and others, drawing our attention to the actualization and development of a subjectivity already implicitly intersubjective in its structure. So it elicits from it a certain exercise of intersubjectivity. One is reminded of the analogous attempts in the past to integrate into a new whole the substance-oriented definition of person in Boethius and the relation-oriented notion of person in Richard of St. Victor. The interplay here of subjectivity and intersubjectivity is evident in the linguistic capability of what traditionally has been described as the zoon logikon, whose primordial ability to speak makes it possible for other speakers to elicit in the self its own acts and habits of speech. Robert Spemann goes one step further to observe in the chapter on recognition in his 1996 work on persons, describing a kind of return to the other. He writes, quote, "We do not know whether we ourselves understand a language until we know whether others understand it," end quote. We might note here what is characteristic for Spemann of the proximate end of the dynamics of intersubjectivity, not just that I recognize my own dignity, but that I recognize the dignity of others, and within many of the same limits, has a parallel in Ricoeur's course of recognition as we move from the recognition of others, of me, to my recognition of myself, to my recognition of others, both de facto and de jure. As Spemann puts it in this chapter, there is no privileged access to one's own personhood. Rather, our own personhood is not a given for us any earlier than the personhood of others. Both my personhood and that of the other remain ineffable. Both of them refer to what the tradition called each person as incommunicabilis, as something which is not substitutable by others. Thomas applied his caution about the degree to which we can know ourselves in his analysis of Proclus. Had he applied that caution that we don't really know our own essence, our own personhood, if you like, he might well have spoken of the transcendental apperception as a kind of reditio incompleta in se ipsum, a much used phrase but if you look at Thomas's nuances, even in the commentary on De Causis, you will see that it is a reditio incompleta in se ipsum. Where Martin Heidegger's famous integration of hermeneutics into phenomenology and being and time had rejected the conceit of presuppositionless thought for any existence by recommending that we instead find ways to enter in the right way into the already living, inexhaustible, non-vicious hermeneutical circle between our understanding and its interpretation, Rothhaar, Ricoeur, and Spemann all seem to suggest, if in a slightly different way, that we enter by reflection the already established, not circle, but ellipse of subjectivity and intersubjectivity with its twin foci of selfhood and alterity. Even on this side of identifying the absolute starting point of all finite subjectivity or intersubjectivity, there is a sufficient basis in this lived elliptical dynamic, which is always and already given, the temporal and narrative course of emerging identity and alterity, to serve as a basis for ethical norms and laws in the pursuit of what Ricoeur has described as, quote, a good life with and for others in just institutions, end quote. Our denial or misrecognition of the dignity and freedom of others, which is not just a possibility, but an always already given fact, our denial or misrecognition of the dignity and freedom of others comes at the price of a misrecognition of the dignity and freedom of ourselves, just as the suppressed or unrecognized sense of the dignity and responsibility of the self will prove detrimental to society as well. Without claiming that this sense, scope, and normative course of recognition exhausts the meaning of person, Rothhaar argues that the practical dialectic of subjectivity and intersubjectivity is what is at the core of much of modern language of persons, and the chief place where the normativity it spawns becomes tangible and institutional. Granting his reference to the provenance of modern discourse around personhood in practical or ethical reason, Rothhaar could easily have added in his frequent references to the interpersonal dynamic in the thought of Robert Spemann an additional argument for our particular attention to recognition. The guiding thesis of Spemann's 1989 study on happiness and benevolence is that ethics needs to complement its Aristotelian starting point in the pursuit of one's own happiness with something like a conscient dimension of the recognition of and benevolence towards the other as a good in and for themselves, in which contrast Aristotle, striving for one's own happiness, appears the more idealistic thinker, and Kant, with his recognition of the person, the more realistic one. Spemann's suspicions of an exclusively eudaimenistic approach, even one complemented by reflections on the opportunities provided by generous friendship, are strengthened by what Rolf Schoenberger has described as the central theme of Spemann's thought, the critique of functionalism and instrumentalization. Already evident in Spemann's initial works with his analysis of the instrumentalization of tradition by the counter-revolutionary Restoration in France, and then in his reconstruction of the debate between Fenelon and Bossuet on selfless love, Spemann would extend his critique of instrumentalization later to the models of ethical consequentialism, even while rejecting the adequacy of a purely deontological Gesinnungsethik or ethic of conscience, or of any other hybrid version of these two. The recognition of oneself and others as persons in one of the many steps beyond ourselves. So just stop for a moment and say that we're really made thinkers often by our opponents, and Spemann's favorite opponent at this phase of his life seems to be Hume, with the thought that we never take a step beyond ourselves. He finds that a kind of a summary or summa of present-day problems, and Spemann is out to show, in opposition to Hume, always how we always take steps beyond ourselves, and that makes us what we are. So in one of the many steps beyond ourselves and beyond the presence of my immediate perceptions and desires, there is a kind of distance, distance to myself, that leads to unique forms of nearness, that the source of the self is when we leave ourselves, take a step beyond ourselves, and are able then to identify ourselves, to recognize ourselves. Such distance makes possible what Levinas would intend under the term exteriority. If Markus Rothhaar's and Robert Spemann's reflections on persons show parallels to Ricoeur's path towards mutual recognition, we can ask then in this response if Ricoeur's the course of recognition could also concur with the discussion of soul, the third figure in this conference, but one which was beyond the scope of Ricoeur and Rothhaar's explicit presentations. Even in Spemann's book on persons, the chapter on the soul is limited to an extension of the expectation of immortality as an unthematic or habitual postulate of practical reason, from the affirmation on one's own mortality to the affirmation of those others who are loved. Spemann has things to say about the soul in other works, but in this work he is concerned simply with expanding and deepening Kant's postulate of practical reason to be more directed to the other than to oneself. The famous passages, such as in the beginning of Thomas Aquinas' De Regno and parallels, which Joseph Pieper would share with Arnold Galen, point to the many native deficiencies in human beings that are more than compensated for by familial and communal assistance, especially thanks to language, where the enablement of the one by the many others across time is most evident, as he tells us. But Thomas knows as well of other forms of this ellipse, or the other focus, rather, of this ellipse. Thomas notes, for example, that mercy, the consideration of another's sufferings as one's own with a view towards overcoming them, can be rendered impossible by two false stances towards oneself. Those who have no sense of their own fallibility or who have no hope for themselves will not be able to consider another's sufferings as their own with a view towards overcoming them. Qualified selfhood is here the condition of qualified alterity. Only the incommunicabilis is capable of the communicatio that makes friendship and its mutuality possible. As we noticed as was noticed by Thomas's contemporaries and immediate successors, say in the official censures from 1277 on, and in the Correctories dispute, the later Doctor Communis had formulated initially uncommon positions on the body and the unicity of the intellectual soul as the soul's substantial form. Such a form gears the body towards spiritual and interpersonal goods, but at the same time underscores both the limitations and the necessary assistance that the exterior and interior senses or the passions involve. The human soul, as the least of all intellectual beings in itself, the most empty, needs the exteriority provided by the external and internal senses, so much so that the separated soul was not entitled to be called a person and was, if left to itself, more wounded than enhanced by its loss of bodiliness, a reverse of the Neoplatonic tradition from Porphyry. The need of the soul, in Thomas's view, for what Levinas would later call exteriority finds important complements today in discussions of human intentionality outside the thematic of interpersonality, such as in Günther Figal's recent phenomenology of our sense of external space as the condition of the possibility of any knowledge at all, but also throughout Spemann's work on persons, for example, in the chapter on time. The exteriority of other persons intensifies but does not substitute for the exteriority of non-personal otherness. Even Heidegger's Being in Time, which lacks the exteriority of the body and plays down the analysis of the social world, even here, exteriority includes the manifold possibilities of my being other than I am, avoiding the collapse of past and future into the present, something that would be important for theology and church leadership today, including famously the one insurpassable possibility, death, the becoming impossible of properly human possibilities. In Thomas Aquinas' own eschatology, understood as novel both by his opponents and by his supporters, such as Bernard of Trillia, the post-mortal soul does not cease to be a part of the now lost whole. It does not itself begin to be a whole. The human spirit is not advanced simply by shedding materiality. Of itself, human knowledge tends to become by that more general and confused, as Bernard of Trilly would argue, unless these deficiencies are compensated for by exterior powers. The scholastic term for alterity or exteriority of this kind is timor reverentiae or timor filialis. That is the old term for alterity, if you like, which both before and after death is needed to recognize the otherness of the giver and the gracious character of the gift. Because resurrection cannot be deduced as likely from reflection upon our own desires and powers, and is not evident, humans can at most live like Job, ex fiducia veritatis manifestande. The implicit recognition of personhood, often made explicit by pain of its misrecognition, is a hope not to become persons in the future, but a hope that in the future the personhood and mutual recognition already given will be manifested and perfected. Like the hope that we are already in grace, there is room for the hope that we are already indeed persons, a hope which strengthens the witness of other persons that made such hope possible, and in the best case made it plausible. The mutual recognition of persons as called to the fullness of knowledge, love, and life calls us as well to a protreptic defense of hope for oneself and others. Thank you.
Here we have time for some questions. As usual, if you would state your name, the institution you're coming from, if you're coming from one, and the speaker to whom you are directing your questions. First hand I saw was in the far back, and then we'll go over to Father Ansel. So, in the back first.
I'm David Schindler from the John Paul II Institute. I want to thank you both for your papers. They were both outstanding papers, very, very interesting. My question is addressed to Markus. I appreciate very much your argument in general. One point that I have a certain question about is your characterization of political order in terms of the mutual limitation of freedom. Yep. And I want to give an argument for that in a moment, but why do I find that somewhat problematic? It seems to me that thinking of relating to others in terms of limiting freedom seems to take for granted a kind of atomistic individualism, wherein we sort of act on each other from the outside, and in that case we need to put some extrinsic limits to that, which is the basis of a liberal political order. Now the reason I think a very different way to think about that would be to deepen this question of intersubjectivity as the precondition for subjectivity in a somewhat different way. In addition to the very interesting things that you said, this tension came out in your talk in a number of ways, but there's a certain contradiction to say that intersubjectivity precedes subjectivity, because intersubjectivity is a relation of subjects. So if it precedes it, then it presupposes what it precedes. And you talked about different ways of getting out of that, but one of a very different kind of approach is, perhaps you're familiar with this, it was coined by, or developed by Hans Urs von Balthasar, and also Ferdinand Ulrich and Gustav Sievert, various philosophers who critique that intersubjective approach because it always takes for granted the relationship between adult consciousness. In a certain sense, it begins from a rather abstract perspective. Hans Urs von Balthasar begins with what he calls, in both a real way and a symbolic way, the mother's smile, You begin with a child,
Yep.
and the child is awakened into subjectivity, not through an intersubjective relation, but by first being loved by the mother in a way that it can't reciprocate. And by virtue of that, come to a capacity to reciprocate. We see the phenomenon in language. You don't begin with a conversation. You begin with a child being lovingly addressed for years, and then finally able to enter into conversation. The intersubjective part begins. It's not an Aufforderung. It's a gift of love that invites. So just to now connect that with the freedom issue, if you begin in that way, it seems to me that the presence of the other is at the very origin of my subjectivity. It's not something that I achieve. And if that's the case, it leads one to think of freedom much more in terms of a inhering in others and a receiving and giving in relation to others, a much more intrinsic relationship, in which case to talk about the limitation of freedom would not make any sense. You would rather speak about the deepening of freedom and the education of freedom and so forth, and not the limitation. The limitation seems to put you back in the old problem. How would you respond to all that? Sorry for a very long question.
So, okay, do I have another 40 minutes? So, first the point about limiting freedom. That is, no, let me start with the other point. I mean, you said there is a problem about saying that intersubjectivity somehow precedes or is prior to subjectivity, and you gave the example of a mother smiling at her child, and so of love. And I think this is precisely what these approaches mean by intersubjectivity, a relation, for example, of love or friendship or whatever, which is necessary to somehow, and let me really put it in that term, you also said that, to awaken the subjectivity which is in some way already present in the human being that is addressed in this way. So I think we would agree here probably, because I think that what you have pointed out is precisely what these authors mean by intersubjectivity. It's not something that it would be a misunderstanding to think of intersubjectivity as something that works without subjects. So intersubjectivity precisely wants to speak about the relation between subjects, and when we speak of priority of intersubjectivity, we just want to say that subjects can only be subjects, or rather, as I would put it, that subjects can only be persons insofar as they are in relation with other persons. I think that's the basic idea of this whole recognition theoretical approach. And so I think we actually agree. Maybe it's just a problem with the words here, with the wording here. The second point, limiting freedom. Yes, of course. Fichte, in his Foundation of Natural Right, tries to give an account of a liberal concept of the political sphere or of the legal system. That does not mean that other dimensions of intersubjectivity are excluded from the picture. Fichte himself doesn't speak much about that, but in other works, like in his Ethics, he speaks about things like friendship and so on, which go back to the same or a similar structure of intersubjectivity, but that's not his task in the Foundation of Natural Right. In the Foundation of Natural Right, he just wants to show why we have certain negative rights, or why everybody has to recognize everybody else as a bearer of certain negative rights, because it's a philosophy of law. So it's not a social philosophy, it's a philosophy of law. You can extend or expand the recognition theoretical approach into a social philosophy, and I think basically Hegel did that. And I mean that's a big part of Hegel's critique of Fichte's philosophy of law, that he says, well, what are you talking about? You are talking about recognition, but the only aspect of recognition which you are talking about is the mutual limitation of spheres of freedom. But if you take the concept of recognition seriously, then it's not only about negative relations, like limiting different spheres of freedom, but then you also have to talk about positive relations like acknowledgement, esteem, friendship, and so on. But I think one can defend Fichte in a certain way at this point here, even against Hegel and against your objection, by pointing out that what he wants to do in the foundation of natural right is precisely to lay the foundation for a philosophy of law. And law is, well, at least at its basis, a system of mutual regulation, of the regulation of our freedom, of our freedom with other people's freedom.
Very good. Father Anselm and then Dr. Mercier.
I wanted to pick up on one of your statements at the end, quoting Robert Spemann on membership in the human species, the biological species. Maybe you can resolve a little bit of a puzzle I always had with that, because on the one hand, as you said earlier, in this recognition, one doesn't want to rely on specific descriptive properties, and you characterize that as a liberal approach. On the other hand, membership in the biological species would seem to rely on very descriptive kind of properties. And there seems to be something of a leap there, and perhaps also an indication that we need a more robust notion of the self, as Father Richard said. That in the absence of that, we cannot explain precisely these things with children. You know, I mean, how do you recognize a child that is not yet capable of intersubjectivity in the same way? So maybe that needs to be fleshed out more, or maybe a distinction between kinds of properties.
Yes. It has to be fleshed out a little bit more, and I think that in Spemann's argument, this is actually a problem. His reference to the species Homo sapiens, because first of all, one might think that's a property. To be member of a species, that's a property. And there are also problems when it comes to determining what a species is. I mean, actually in the philosophy of biology, they don't have a clear concept of species. I mean, if you ask philosophers of biology what a species is, they will just turn their back to you and say, oh my God, species. Well, we have around 12 theories about that. No, I think that's really a problem in the argument, and therefore I did not specifically refer to species membership, but rather to entelechy. I think that's a better approach to work out what Spemann actually meant. I think the argument, as I tried to point it out, is basically that if recognition is something that transcends an individual finite subject, it somehow has to refer to something that is not made by a finite individual subject in order to determine the scope of the community of rights, or the scope of bearers of human dignity and human rights, and that is in a more general term nature. I think this is what Spemann means, that we somehow have to refer to something that is not made by us, and what is not made by us is called nature. And unfortunately, he then speaks about membership of the species of Homo sapiens with all the problems included there. I mean, for example, with gene editing, maybe we can blur the boundaries between species, and so what would a being with, let's say, 80% pig genome and 20% human genome, then B, for example, would it be a member of the human species or a member of the pig species? That's not clear at all, but I think that we can deal with these problems if we do not talk about species membership, but about entelechy, and then we are back to all the problems of forms and soul and so on, but I think that would be a more appropriate approach.
Well, I think you really need to include entelechy. I actually don't know the history of that word, except that it came up during the vitalist controversies in the early 1920s. But I had heard that it was a substitute for the Thomistic concept of form. And when you first started to speak, I thought, oh boy, this is going to create tremendous problems for explaining anti-abortion, anti-embryo research, and so forth, because there's no way of recognizing that little glob of tissue as one of us. But if you've got the concept of an Aristotelian form, then you've also got the concept of procreation, such that you know that if this is a product of the sexual relations between two humans, it is human. And I also agree, and so I'm agreeing with you that you can't define who counts as a person on the basis of appearances. But I think, I'm trying to think of the hardest case for you, and the hardest case that I can think of would be a feral child where you have no knowledge of it being where, how, when it was born, and it's past the point of being capable of developing intersubjective relationships. It seems then that you wouldn't say that, well, we have to change our definition of what counts as a person, but we're going to have to use the empirical appearance of this being as a criterion to count it as having a human nature. So you get back to needing to incorporate the empirical anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think the concept of entelechia is already an Aristotelian concept. I mean, he uses that concept actually, and so I think that and it is a kind of form that brings about itself. So I think that by recurring to this concept, I probably can avoid the problem that you have mentioned, but I'm not so sure about that. And I don't even think that it's possible, I mean, but that would probably also be to have, we would have to check that empirically, that a human being can be beyond the point of developing something like a personal identity or subjectivity. Yeah, you think so? Okay, I have to think about that, but because, I mean, for example, in Germany there was this, after the war, lots of orphan children who grew up in the forest somewhere in East Prussia, occupied by the Russians at the time, and when they got into contact with other human beings, they very soon developed something like subjectivity or self-awareness, self-consciousness, which obviously doesn't happen with animals when you treat them like that.
Just a short thought that I think one of the tests from the recognition theory would be, in all these cases, not whether there is an active exercise of obviously human character or even intersubjective characteristics, but whether we regret the fact that there are not. As long as you can mourn that they're not happening there, whether it's in a young child that is somehow prevented from developing, whether it's in a feral child, a Kasper-Hauser kind of situation, or whether it is in the aged, as long as you can say that there's a regret. I think that corresponds both to something like the mainstream of the early Frankfurt School. You learn from the history of tragedy in a certain sense. But also I think it belongs to the way in which Thomas Aquinas tells us that we can identify what is natural law and see it as part of the eternal law, really by being taught what happens when it's violated.
Oh, and by the way, just one remark. You spoke about appearance, and that's actually Fichte's solution to the problem, because he asked this question also. So why do we interact with human beings, even if they are children or whatever, in a way as if they were already subjects, and why do we not do this with animals or with stones or whatever? And his answer is, it's because they have a human appearance, because they have a human shape. He uses Gestalt. I mean, that's there was a lot about this concept of Gestalt sometimes in the English-speaking countries, but in German it's just shape or appearance, and that's Fichte's solution to the problem you have brought up.
So we actually have time for one more question.
Thanks. And Chris Hauser from Rutgers. So I really think intersubjectivity is also really important, but I'm worried about our using it as an approach to what makes something a person. Mm-hmm. So here's the sort of worry. So the first two features of the recognitional approach, the first feature you said that was that intersubjectivity is a condition on the possibility of individual finite subjectivity. Yep. And then the second feature was that intersubjectivity requires reciprocal recognition. And I'm worried there's a kind of equivocation on intersubjectivity. Mm-hmm. And that equivocation shows up also in the discussion of solipsism. So distinguish two conditions a human being could find them in. One is a condition where that human being is the only being that exists. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a solipsistic kind of condition. Mm-hmm. Another condition is that human being is the only person that exists. Yeah. But there are other non-persons around. Yeah. And so you might think that, yes, in order to be aware of myself as a self, there has to be some other that I'm aware of that I can distinguish myself from. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't require that there are other persons. That doesn't require that in order to be a person, there has to be some other person that I recognize as a person, then recognize myself as a person. I can, in sort of being in an environment with non-persons, in being aware of them, I can recognize myself as something fundamentally different from those things. Yes,
you could recognize yourself as something different from even that is difficult. I mean, my idea was, by referring to Manfred Frank and Henrich, that there is already present in every human being, and maybe that's part of the human form, a kind of pre-reflexive self-awareness. I mean, phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty and so on, have tried to trace this back to our bodily existence, for example, that we have a bodily self-awareness of some kind already, even without intersubjectivity. So that is on the other hand, again, the subjective core of intersubjectivity. But in order to form a kind of a personal identity, and that was my point, we need more than just an implicit, instantaneous self-awareness in which is given but only implicitly in every act of referring to some object, in order to be persons in the sense of subject with a certain identity over time that is more than just an instantaneous implicit self-awareness in every act of referring to an object. For this, we need the perspective of another, and I think that's what I wanted to try to show, and I don't think that this is possible with reference to stones or animals or whatever. Of course, I mean, if there is this kind of implicit self-awareness, we know that we are not the stone or whatever, but in order to know that we are persons, we somehow need the perspective of another person. I mean, of course, if there would not be any other person on the world, I would still know that I am not identical with this stuff here, or that I am not identical with the wood of the benches here. But I could not form a personal identity over time, I think.
Please join me in